Welcome to the debate. Moses freed a people, but died outside the promise.
Yeah, he was left entirely on the outside.
Exactly. I mean, how do you process that? We're looking at the ultimate deliverer, right? The man who literally freed a population from slavery and led them toward this ultimate destination. But his own story ends with him, well, just seeing that promised land from a distance.
Just standing on a mountain looking at it.
Right, he became a bridge for millions to cross, but the bridge itself never actually reaches the destination. So why does Moses' life end at the edge of the promise? What truly forged him into the deliverer of Israel? Was it his upbringing as a prince of Egypt? You know, the education, the status, that systemic access?
Right, the palace.
Broken of his imperial arrogance, really, so that he could rely entirely on divine power.
I come at it from a different way. I argue that the royal palace was absolutely essential. I mean, why does his story even begin with that danger at birth? He's placed in the Nile, and it lands him exactly in Pharaoh's court. That wasn't just some biographical accident. It was a strategic advantage.
You think the palace was a strategic setup?
Oh, absolutely. He had a dual identity. He was educated in Egyptian statecraft, military strategy, but he maintained this deep psychological tether to the Hebrew people. Moses essentially held the root-level password to the Egyptian operating system. I just don't think the Exodus happens without the intellectual framework of the Prince of Egypt.
Well, let me lay the groundwork for my side, because I actually think the text actively critiques his royal background.
Okay?
When Moses first attempts to step into that role of a liberator, his reliance on his royal conditioning is a catastrophic failure.
You're talking about the taskmaster.
Right, the murder of the Egyptian taskmaster. We see him acting as a prince. He attempts to enforce justice by his own physical strength. And what does that actually achieve? I mean, it doesn't spark a slave rebellion.
No, it doesn't.
I mean, I absolutely agree that his initial attempt was a total disaster. But I view that disaster as a misapplication of the right tools, not proof that the tools were useless. How are they the right tools if he had to flee for his life?
Well, think about the sheer improbability of his survival as an infant. Jochebed's tragic sacrifice, putting him in that basket. He grew up forming an inseparable bond with the young prince who would become Pharaoh. He understood the bureaucratic code. I mean, Moses was literally the only Hebrew in existence with the access and the psychological proximity to challenge the most powerful king on earth face to face. God didn't need to erase that background. He needed to repurpose it.
That's an interesting point, though. I would definitely frame it differently. Let's look at the psychology of power in that specific incident with the taskmaster, because to me, it illustrates the sheer toxicity of his palace upbringing.
Okay, walk me through that.
Well, Moses walks out, he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. He checks to see if anyone is watching, kills the Egyptian, and then buries the body in the sand.
Right.
This is a perfect distillation of imperial conditioning. He uses violence, he acts in total secrecy, and he assumes the authority of an executioner. It's like trying to dismantle a house using the master's own tools. He's trying to use the methods of the oppressor to liberate the oppressed. It merely proves that human intervention, human violence, cannot manufacture spiritual deliverance.
Yeah, the methodology was deeply flawed. He acted out of impulse for sure. But if you look deeper at the underlying motivation, I think it actually proves that his royal upbringing didn't overwrite his Hebrew heart.
You don't think so?
No, not entirely. The text clearly positions Moses between two worlds. The lullaby his mother sang to him, the whispers of the servants, these formed a psychological anchor. When he sees that sleeve being beaten, his reaction isn't that of a detached Egyptian magistrate. The suffering felt strangely personal.
But the execution of that feeling was still imperial.
Yes, the execution was an imperial reaction, but the awakening of his conscience was a subversive Hebrew trigger. And let me ask you this. If Moses had not possessed the innate confidence, the conditioned authority of an Egyptian prince, do you really think he would have dared to step in and defend a slave against a government official in the first place?
I see why you think that. But let me give you a different perspective. That princely audacity, that is exactly what disqualified him.
Really?
Yes. You're framing his confidence as an asset, but the Hebrew people immediately recognized it as just another flavor of oppression. They saw right through the vigilantism. When they said, "Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" They were rejecting his authority because it was rooted in the palace. They didn't see a brother, they saw a lord asserting dominance. And the moment his secret is exposed, that supposed royal confidence, it completely evaporates.
Well, he panics.
He runs. He doesn't leverage his status to defend his actions. He is instantly reduced to a fugitive, abandoning the systemic power you claimed was so essential.
It evaporated temporarily, I'll give you that. But the instinct was preserved. Which honestly brings us to the sociology of his exile in the wilderness. He wanders into Midian, completely detached from the Egyptian power structure, right? And what is the very first thing he does at the well?
He enters sociological isolation. He is stripped of his rank.
But wait, before he settles into that isolation, he witnesses a group of shepherdesses being driven away from the water by rival shepherds. He doesn't cower.
That's true.
He steps forward, stands his ground, and drives the aggressors away. The instinct for justice, the willingness to leverage his own strength on behalf of the weak, that remained fully intact in the desert. The wilderness didn't erase the Prince of Egypt. It just put his tactical instincts into a holding pattern while he learned the humility required to govern them. And the ultimate proof of this is the calling itself. When God speaks from the burning bush, what is the directive? Why does God call a fugitive from the wilderness? He doesn't tell him to start a new utopian society out in the desert. God says, "Go, I am sending you to Pharaoh." If his past was meant to be entirely discarded, God wouldn't have intentionally sent him back into the exact bureaucratic machine he was raised in.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because you really have to look at the psychological state of the man being sent back. For 4 decades, Moses was at the absolute bottom of the ancient Near Eastern social hierarchy. He was a shepherd.
Right.
The text implies a profound trauma in this displacement. There's a fascinating academic insight regarding his response at the burning bush. When God commands him to return, Moses doesn't produce his royal resume. He resists the call. He says, "Who am I?" And crucially, "I am not eloquent."
The stutter.
Exactly. Some scholars suggest this stutter, this loss of eloquence, was a trauma response. He had literally lost his Egyptian tongue. He had lost the rhetorical polish of the court. So in a pharaonic court that highly valued rhetoric and performative speech, God chooses a man who can barely speak.
That is a stark contrast, yeah.
It is a deliberate theological subversion of imperial norms. The absolute, profound humility of a broken man was the mandatory prerequisite for God to reveal himself. God wasn't weaponizing Moses' past. He was demonstrating that earthly power was completely irrelevant to the deliverance.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the interpersonal dynamics when he actually arrives back in Egypt? When Moses and Aaron finally step into that throne room, it is not a generic diplomatic exchange.
No, it's highly tense.
Right. The text focuses heavily on the relational tragedy between Moses and Pharaoh. Pharaoh doesn't just see a stuttering shepherd. He sees the brother he grew up with. He says things like, I defended you. I refused to believe the brother I grew up with would simply abandon everything.
It's a battle of broken brotherhood.
Exactly. Pharaoh's resistance is deeply tied to a sense of unresolved betrayal. The psychological weight of the demand, "let my people go," rests entirely on the fact that Moses was raised in that specific palace. Moses was uniquely placed to bridge the impossible gap between an enslaved people and a powerful empire, precisely because he was intimately familiar with the psychology of the oppressor.
I don't deny the emotional gravity of the throne room scenes, but let's look at the actual mechanics of the deliverance. Did that shared childhood accomplish anything tangible? Did their brotherhood persuade Pharaoh to dismantle his slave economy?
Well, it established the necessary access to the throne.
Access, yes, but it yielded absolutely zero persuasion. Pharaoh's heart is repeatedly described as imprisoned by pride. He says, "Who is the Lord that I should obey him? I do not know the Lord." Moses' relational proximity to Pharaoh completely failed to mitigate the suffering of the Hebrews diplomatically. In fact, things got worse for them initially.
They had to gather their own straw.
Right. What actually secures the deliverance are the plagues. And the plagues are not just random ecological disasters, they are a targeted, systematic dismantling of the Egyptian pantheon.
Exactly, they are a theological war.
Right. When the Nile turns to blood, it is a direct attack on the god of the Nile. When the sun is blotted out in darkness, it's an assault on the supreme sun god. This was a confrontation between divine powers. Earthly diplomacy was entirely bypassed. Think about the analogy of the staff Moses carries.
Okay.
Moses was essentially the wooden staff. The staff itself possesses no inherent magic, no royal pedigree, no diplomatic leverage. It is strictly the power of the one holding the staff that brings the plagues and divides the sea. In the final hours of the Exodus, Moses' Egyptian background is rendered completely moot.
I'm sorry, I don't buy that the background becomes moot. Let me tell you why. The plagues are indeed a theological dismantling, but the impact of that dismantling is amplified by the psychology of the palace.
How so?
Pharaoh is watching the brother who betrayed him become the very instrument of Egypt's suffering. Pharaoh engages in this drawn-out, devastating war of wills precisely because it is Moses standing there. If a random, unknown Hebrew slave had walked into the court with a wooden staff demanding the release of the workforce, Pharaoh would have simply had him executed on the spot.
I suppose that's practically true.
Right, the only reason the narrative unfolds the way it does, allowing for the systematic deconstruction of Egypt's gods, is because Pharaoh's pride and his history with Moses keep him engaged in the conflict.
Well, if you're listening to this and thinking, okay, the relationship kept Pharaoh at the table, we still have to ask what ultimately broke him, because it wasn't a conversation, it was the Passover. Let's look at that final, devastating plague, because it perfectly encapsulates my point.
The death of the firstborn.
Yes, and what is the mechanism of salvation for the Israelites in that moment? It requires no royal pedigree. It requires no insider knowledge of the Egyptian operating system. It requires them to sacrifice a lamb and brush its blood onto the doorposts of their homes. God promised to pass over every home marked by that blood. The Exodus was a triumph of obedience and divine power, completely divorced from Moses' diplomatic standing. The blood of the lamb shielded them, not the prince of Egypt.
But look at the aftermath of that midnight. The silence in Egypt is shattered by grief, from the smallest house to Pharaoh's own palace. When Pharaoh calls Moses in the dark of early morning, his anger is replaced by total defeat. Go, take your people. That surrender is experienced relationally. Pharaoh isn't just yielding to a superior deity. He's yielding to the reality that his brother's God has conquered his own. The interpersonal tragedy is the narrative vehicle for the empire's humiliation.
And yet even after that supposed relational surrender, Pharaoh changes his mind. He rallies his chariots and traps the Israelites against the Red Sea, which brings us to the ultimate test of leadership. The Israelites are in an absolute panic, facing the most powerful military machine in the ancient world, and they turn on Moses. They ask, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us out here to die? Now, if his Egyptian military training was the key, this is the moment he should have organized a defense. He should have used his tactical knowledge.
But he doesn't.
He's fully completed his unmaking. He has completely surrendered his reliance on the tactics of the empire. He raises that wooden staff, the east wind divides the waters, and they cross on dry ground. When the Egyptian army follows in their imperial pride, the waters collapse on them. The liberation is achieved purely through divine mechanics, not human strategy.
The power dividing the water is divine, absolutely. I am not disputing that. But the leader standing on the shore, absorbing the immense sociological and psychological weight of millions of panicked, terrified people, that is a man whose resilience was forged in the palace and the desert.
Both of them.
Yes, God utilized every fragment of his past. The education gave him the organizational capacity to lead a nation. The trauma gave him the empathy to understand their brokenness. And the wilderness gave him the endurance to survive the decades ahead. When they reach the far shore, Moses isn't just a shepherd who got lucky. He is the amalgamation of the Hebrew child in the basket, the prince in the palace, and the exile in Midian.
It is a remarkable synthesis, I will grant you that. But as the source material makes painfully clear, The crossing of the Red Sea was not an ending, it was merely a prologue. Beyond that water lay the Sinai Peninsula. Ahead of Moses was the task of receiving the law, mediating a covenant, and shepherding a deeply traumatized, rebellious people through a barren wasteland. Was Pharaoh the greatest obstacle, or was leading the people through the wilderness even harder?
Oh, I'd say the wilderness was harder. And that wilderness leadership required a man who could navigate impossible spaces. Why does Sinai matter so much in Moses' story? Because he had to act as the mediator there, standing between the terrifying presence of God and a people who were just too afraid to approach the mountain themselves. He bore the burden of their constant complaints, their idolatry with the golden calf, and their refusal to trust.
Which brings us back to the staggering paradox we opened with. Moses' story is a profound study in the tension of carrying a calling that is fundamentally larger than the individual. I maintain that it was his emptying in the wilderness, his sociological isolation, and his loss of earthly power that made him a vessel capable of holding that calling. He had to unlearn the empire to lead the people.
And I maintain that without the dual world identity provided by Pharaoh's household, he would never have had the conceptual framework or the proximity to challenge the empire in the first place. His history was not erased. It was entirely repurposed.
We may not perfectly align on which phase of his life was the primary catalyst, but we certainly converge on the reality that his life was a meticulously crafted instrument, and it leaves us contemplating the incredible, somewhat heartbreaking reality of his legacy. Moses was the man who faced down the greatest empire on earth, who parted the waters, who delivered the law, and who carried a nation on his back.
But he never steps foot in the promised land. He brings them to the very edge of the Jordan River. He views the expanse of the land from Mount Nebo, and he dies there, outside the promise.
Because the mission of God in the biblical narrative continues beyond even its most monumental human leaders. It is a sobering, educational reminder that true deliverance often requires a person to become the bridge for others. And we have to accept that a bridge allows a whole generation to cross into the destination, even while the bridge itself remains firmly rooted outside of it.
It proves that the calling is always larger than the person who carries it.
Exactly. It leaves us to reflect on how our own deepest worldly privileges and our most profound personal failures might be woven together for a mission we may never fully see completed. There is so much more to explore in this text. Thank you for listening.